No exaggeration, when it comes to spreading information and communicating, the internet is the greatest thing we have ever come up with. We can connect with millions of people, we can share and develop exciting new ideas, and we can even disrupt entire industries. No exaggeration, when it comes to spreading information and communicating, the internet is the greatest thing we have ever. No exaggeration, when it comes to spreading information and communicating, the internet is the greatest thing we have ever come up with. We can connect with millions of people, we can share and develop exciting new ideas, and we can even disrupt entire exaggeration. When it comes to spreading information and communicating, the internet is the greatest thing we have ever. No exaggeration, when it comes to spreading information and communicating, the internet is the greatest thing we have ever. We can connect with millions of people, we can share and develop exciting new ideas, and we can even disrupt entire exaggeration.
Together, we hope to advance this legislation through the Congress and restore these essential protections for all Americans. I would also like to remind my friends, and particularly my friends on the other side of the aisle, that this is the bill that is before the committee today, and this is the issue that we're discussing. Together, I am happy to advance about other issues at the appropriate time for all Americans. Today, I would also like to remind my friends, and particularly my friends on the other side of the aisle,
with us today. Glad you're here. Well, I'm always happy to be here with my colleagues to learn more from the real experts on important issues in the telecom space. I have to admit, I am confused why we need to spend another entire hearing on net neutrality less than a month after talking about the same thing. In the meantime, the majority has introduced essentially the same bill that has already failed to garner the support of their entire caucus as a CRA in the last Congress. Make no mistake, there are a lot of different ways for Congress to go about protecting consumers with permanent net neutrality rules. For example, the bill I introduced last month is based on Chairman Waxman's approach in 2010, and my colleagues, Republican Leader Walden and Mrs. Rogers, offered two more bills based on the rules from FCC's 2015 order and Washington State's bipartisan legislation from 2018. These bills all originated from Democratic net neutrality proposals or laws. Anyone interested in a bipartisan legislative solution would consider each of them to be a reasonable starting point for real discussion. In contrast, the majority came to that hearing with no ideas. Since that time, we have not heard a word from them until they were ready to announce yet another net neutrality hearing. Worst of all, instead of engaging with us to try to solve the problem, my colleagues have retrenched back to the most extreme position in this debate. The idea that only Title II is real net neutrality is dangerous and wrong. Those who are newer to the subcommittee or to this debate should not be fooled. You have heard over and over again that we need to protect consumers from blocking, throttling, and internet fast lanes, which sounds reasonable enough. Well, we can easily do all of this without giving the government free rein over the internet through the specter of Title II. Everyone who has followed this net neutrality debate, or on even the most superficial level, is aware that Title II is a non-starter with Republicans and even with some Democrats. It has no chance of even passing the Senate or being signed into law. Yet, here we are in a repetitive hearing followed by a string of partisan victories that will simply ensure that anyone digs in, if anyone digs in further and nothing meaningful ever gets done to protect consumers. Even if there were a chance that the majority's Title II bill would become law, we now know unequivocally that it would be the wrong direction for rural America. As we heard from Mr. Fresnel at the last hearing and from countless other rural carriers as well, Title II was a devastatingly effective investment killer for small ISPs who need to be expanding to serve more of our constituents in rural America. At that hearing, so many members on both sides of the aisle engaged Mr. Fresnel with questions and concerns about this impact. There seems to be an overwhelmingly bipartisan interest in working to close the digital divide and get modern broadband service out to the communities that are being left behind. So why aren't we spending our time working together on that instead of putting the crushing regulatory regime of Title II back onto the folks we need to be out there investing and expanding? It makes no sense. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, Chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. Words like net neutrality and open internet don't capture how central this issue is for our society. We're talking about what the country stands for. We're talking about saving economic opportunity and innovation, saving our kids' educational opportunities, and saving our democracy. That's important. Without net neutrality, a free and open internet simply does not exist. We've all heard the fears of our constituents. In my district, small businesses like Rockstar Bakery and Second Life Bikes in Asbury Park are concerned that without net neutrality, their businesses could be blocked from reaching their customers. They worry large corporations could buy fast lanes, which would make their businesses less competitive. Conservatives and liberals alike worry about their voices being shut down by corporations that don't agree with their point of view. And without access to a free and open internet, my constituents are worried it would be harder to find a job, harder to get the training they need, and harder for their kids to keep up at school. After all, today people need the internet to find good paying jobs and to prepare their children to succeed in life. A free and open internet isn't just about making sure that we can watch videos on our computers or on our phones. It's much more than that. It's about protecting free speech, commerce, creativity, and innovation. And that's why it's sad that we even have to hold this hearing on legislating to safeguard the internet. The FCC's order in 2015 established strong net neutrality rules, and that was upheld twice in federal court. The debate about net neutrality was over. Consumers and small businesses were protected. But the Trump FCC defied the American people and rolled back those common sense protections. It didn't matter that polling showed that 86% of Americans supported these protections, nor did it matter that a historic 24 million people commented on their action and the overwhelming majority in opposition. And that's why this committee must act. The Save the Internet Act will restore the meaningful net neutrality protections Americans want. It will stop this FCC or a future FCC from undermining free speech, small businesses, and consumers. And we have to act swiftly. There's no time for delay. Without net neutrality, we're already seeing the slow march of anti-consumer behavior. ISPs are charging internet users more for using their smartphone's internet connection on another device. In other instances, they are charging consumers more for watching high-definition videos. And that is not what a free and open internet looks like. So that's why I'm very happy that so many of my colleagues have joined with Chairman Doyle in signing on as original co-sponsors of his legislation. After unveiling the Save the Internet Act last Wednesday, the bill was introduced with 132 original co-sponsors. And the Save the Internet Act will bring back the FCC's commonplace bedrock principles. It will put a cop on the beat at the FCC and protect Americans and small businesses from abusive and discriminatory network practices. Now, with that, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the vice chair of our subcommittee, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui, whatever time she may consume.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. As you know, paid prioritization has been a priority of mine for several years. And I think we all agree that calls terminating at public safety answering points shouldn't be dropped. And various content delivery systems and network traffic operations have become important parts of the internet ecosystem that can improve the consumer experience. The core issue here is ensuring consumers don't have to pay more for the same products and services online. And it doesn't take a technologist to know when you're getting a bad deal. I am mindful of the potential use cases that next-generation networks can facilitate, and I previously introduced legislation to ensure that allowing all consumers to access content equally remains at the center of the important debate on the service requirements and consumer benefits of our open internet policies. I am very pleased that we're having this hearing, and I feel it's very, very necessary. We need a free and open internet, and hearings like this are very necessary. Thank you, and I yield back.
Does the gentleman yield back his time?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning.
Thank you for having this hearing. Before I start, I just have a question for the chair. Does 18 U.S.C. Section 1001 involving false statements to Congress apply to witnesses who testify here even if they don't stand up and swear in?
It does.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank our witnesses, especially our sole Republican witness, Mr. McDowell. It's always good to have you before the committee. A permanent legislative solution produced in good faith with our Democratic colleagues is the only way to protect consumers, innovation, and an open internet. I've repeatedly called for an end to this ridiculous partisan back and forth. It's time for bipartisan legislation that could actually become law. And I think we could find common ground, as this committee has a history of doing. Yet even after offering a menu of bipartisan legislative proposals at our hearing last month to preserve an open internet once and for all, unfortunately, my friends on the other side have not decided to work with us on a bipartisan solution, and I'm really disappointed. The partisan approach is not the answer. It will not become law. Title II is not necessary to preserve a free and open internet. We could permanently ban blocking, we could permanently ban throttling, And to Ms. Matsui's concerns, we could permanently ban paid prioritization without the heavy-handed approach of Title II. We heard last month about the regulatory impact of Title II on rural broadband deployment from a small internet service provider, Mr. Joe Fresnel of Eastern Oregon Telecom. Indeed, he's from my district in Eastern Oregon and across rural America. It's where we rely on small ISPs like Eastern Oregon Telecom to help connect our communities with high-speed internet. In an opinion piece in the East Oregonian that's running this morning, Joe wrote that the heavy hand of Title II shifted Eastern Oregon Telecom's focus from our consumers to regulatory interference and draining cost of reporting and compliance, close quote. Joe went on to say that every dollar he spends on reporting to regulatory agencies is a dollar not spent on serving rural Oregon. Frankly, Title II could provide the federal government near unlimited and unchecked authority to regulate and tax the internet. It's not an internet that protects consumers, nor is that an internet that will allow for American ingenuity to thrive. I think we could do better. I'd also like to take note that the internet seems to be working today, despite all the hyperbolic rhetoric to the contrary last year. So what internet crisis brings us to the hearing room today? It's certainly not the abuses by the tech platforms that occupy the news every day, not the limiting of conservative voices on social media, shadow banning and throttling and things of that nature, not the seeming inability to curb harmful and illicit behavior online, not how tech companies make their deals to prioritize internet traffic on the off-ramps, not their own agreements on sharing of people's personal information. No, that's not what brings us here today. What brings us here is that Speaker Pelosi still believes broadband providers are the real threat, and so I assume directed the majority to move this bill. The internet of today grew dramatically with little or no government interference. Saddling it now with an archaic regulation from the 1930s monopoly-era copper landline phone company seems like an odd way to spur investment and innovation. Meanwhile, big tech companies want complete freedom, not just from regulation, but also from liability for facilitating all sorts of harmful and illicit activity. 20 years ago, a Republican Congress and a Democratic president granted special liability limitations to help the tech sector to flourish. This is Section 230 of the Telecom Act of 1996, and without objection, this bipartisan agreement accomplished its primary objective. Online platforms are now major venues for communication and commerce, and not just in the United States, but around the world. But Section 230 was also supposed to be about responsibility. With a liability limitation in their back pocket, we increasingly see the tech giants wield their power at the wrong targets. When will this subcommittee see either as common carriers in the information age, or how they are the ones with business models that actually use our data for their profits? If you're going to protect consumers online, should those online protections apply to the whole internet ecosystem? Meanwhile, Mr. Chairman, we should hear directly from the Federal Communications Commission about how this legislation will impact the vitality of the internet. I was under the impression the majority planned to have the FCC up here to testify in the first quarter of this year. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet. From a process standpoint and considering the need for the full commission to weigh in on the impact of this proposal, Mr. Chairman, will you commit to letting us have a hearing with the commissioners before this measure is ushered through in a markup? I know Ms. Eshoo was quite vocal last summer when Republicans wanted to match our bipartisan success of enacting the FCC reauthorization with completing an NTIA reauthorization. Despite having had numerous hearings that included NTIA's administrator as well as former administrators and interested parties, there was still a demand by the Democrats to have Mr. Rettel appear again before following our legislative hearing. So I'd like to know is, can we have the commission here before we're asked to mark up this legislation?
I'll make sure to let you know when we invite them.
That's a little different, but thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your response. I yield back.
I would just say to my friend, and he is my friend, that I must have missed the phone call when you said, let's get together and sit down and see if we can work together on net neutrality. What we got instead was 3 bills being dropped without our knowledge before any of us knew about it. I would just suggest to the gentleman that that's not the way to work together.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. For 4 or 5 years, I've had an open door. I've had draft legislation, and I've publicly and privately offered up the opportunity to sit down and work through these things. And the idea of having 3 bills out there was simply to say, here's a menu of options. We didn't expect you to co-sponsor those, but we remain willing to work with you to find a bipartisan solution.
Yeah, I'm glad your door's open. Mine is too. and I just, if you'd have wandered into it, we might have had a conversation before you dropped the bills. Okay, let's move on. Gentleman yields back. Chair wants to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written open statements will be made part of the record. Before I introduce our witnesses, I do want to recognize and introduce a former member of Congress and a member of this Energy and Commerce Committee. Former Congressman Ron Klink is in the audience. Ron, nice to see you. Welcome. Yeah, you could clap for Ron. Okay, I'd now like to introduce our witnesses. Oh, up. And standing right in front of me, Chip Pickering, please. Chip, also a member of the committee. Sorry, Chip. Okay, now, let's get to today's witnesses. Ms. Francella Ocello, Vice President of Policy and General Counsel for the National Hispanic Media. We also have Mr. Gregory Green, Chief Executive Officer of FATBeam. Mr. Former Commissioner Robert McDowell, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and partner at Cooley LLP. And last but not least, Mr. Matt Wood, Vice President of Policy and General Counsel for Free Press Action. We want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us here today. We look forward to your testimony. You're each going to have 5 minutes to do your opening statements. We do not have the lighting system here in front of you, but we'll be tracking this here. And once you get to your 5 minutes, you'll hear a little gentle tap of the gavel and know that it's time to wrap up your testimony if you haven't already done so. So we'll start with Ms. Ocello. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, and other members of the subcommittee. My name is Francella Ocello. I am the Vice President of Policy and General Counsel at the National Hispanic Media Coalition based in Pasadena, California. For years, NHMC has advocated for a free and open internet. We help policymakers and lawmakers like you understand the impact and what's at stake for Americans who do not have the resources or the capacity to engage in these types of debates in Washington, D.C. Today, my comments are intended to reflect those voices, including families, students, creators, and activists who support a free and open internet but do not have the good fortune of being able to join us in this room. The net neutrality consumer protections that we have fought so tirelessly to restore were always intended to safeguard an open and free internet, the one that we envision for tomorrow. Access to that open internet has revolutionized the way that we think, the way that we work, the way that we communicate, the way that we learn. It's challenged the way that we see each other and tested our willingness to grow. In all of its wonder, the internet has also been one of the most important tools in remedying a long history of discrimination that still plagues our country. Taking messages online was the only way that activists were able to get the nation to stop and listen to the cries of Native Americans protecting sacred lands in North Dakota, and how disenfranchised voices were able to put a spotlight on unarmed African American men being shot by police. Online social justice movements forced people to stop and ask hard questions about contaminated water in Flint and why families seeking asylum at the border were irreconcilably separated from their children. But when there's a premium for access, the dangerous underbelly of the internet exposes people to a risk whether or not you're online. Creating a digital caste system of those who can afford to pay more, it feeds the dark chambers of the internet where division and hate speech and discrimination thrive. Sunlight and open access, that is the best remedy, because this internet has connected us in a way that historically our nation has been unable to do so. It serves as the digital encyclopedia where students can go to find out why the Japanese should have never been in internment camps, or the many reasons why Jim Crow was wrong. Being able to discover those unpleasant truths about who we are as a nation and how we grow together requires that all Americans have access to the same information. Under the current regulatory framework, ISPs have no obligation to transmit messages as is. There are no rules that prevent them from blocking content online, slowing down certain websites, or giving preferential treatment. In essence, they have the power to decide what we see online, and whose voices are heard. Simply put, this is a dangerous experiment at the expense of the American people, which should give all of us pause. The United States regularly ranks as one of the most expensive places for internet among developed countries in the world, and affordability remains the main barrier to adoption. In 2018, approximately 24 million people still did not have access to broadband of any kind. 40% of those people 40% of Americans living in rural communities had no access, and 60% of people living on tribal lands faced the same fate. These Americans, all on the wrong side of the digital divide, regularly find their opportunities for growth, their opportunity to participate in our democracy, as well as their upward mobility that is directly linked to their level of access. If we can find a way to provide Wi-Fi for astronauts while they're out of space, I don't understand why we can't find a way to connect people in Peoria, Illinois, or Augusta, Georgia, or Brownsville, Texas, or Chimayo, New Mexico, or even in my hometown of New Orleans, Louisiana. We have a choice. We can affirmatively protect the internet that was started with public funds and always intended for public good, or we can hope that this digital caste system of the haves and the have-nots steers clear of the communities that we call home. We have a responsibility to ensure that every American has an opportunity to participate, as well as a responsibility to understand the insurmountable cost and the consequences when they are disconnected. Because while they may shoulder the individual burden, there is a collective cost. If this is, in fact, the digital revolution, then that means that we are having one of the most important conversations of our time. And we need to be vigilant about understanding the consequences of creating an internet where some have basic and limited access and others get a VIP pass. We have to decide what type of digital infrastructure that we plan to leave behind for generations to come. And the only question that remains is, did we stand up for them when we had the chance? Thank you.
Thank you. We now recognize Mr. Green for 5 minutes.
Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, thank you very much. And members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me. I'm Gregory Green. I'm the CEO and co-founder of FatBeam. FatBeam is a small ISP and fiber-based infrastructure provider in the West Coast. Today, FatBeam operates in 7 markets: Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and Oregon. We also just opened a region in Southwest region in Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. We build fiber optic networks in typically markets Tier 2 and Tier 3, 150,000 in population and below. And in those markets, we provide healthcare providers, government agencies, schools, and other businesses and institutions open access to our network, which also means that we share our fiber network with other ISPs such that they can deliver residential and other services that maybe we don't initially provide in that market space. I've always been a proponent of net neutrality. FatBeam supports net neutrality, and we support very much the FCC order in 2015 for net neutrality. In fact, since net neutrality, we've invested in 8 new markets from the order coming out in 2015. Overall, we've invested $30 million in fiber-based infrastructure, not wireless, but fiber-based infrastructure. And we're in 40 markets, as I mentioned, that we operate today. The driver for that is obviously, or the demand for our inventory and our product set is driven by our customers. When there's a need, we will prevail and we provide that solution. And we very much enjoy coming into a marketplace that is requesting demand and services when in fact there's only maybe an incumbent of a cable company and a phone company in place. In 2017, I wrote a letter, an open letter, supporting the rules for net neutrality. I was concerned about the repeal, and I remain so today. I have 20 plus years in the organization, and I'm very confident that over those years we've had many successes, including that in the cellular industry where we utilize Title II. There's a fallacy that seems to be out there that there's a history in the fallacy of investment where AT&T and Comcast and others would possibly invest less money if net neutrality were to continue. And having looked at those actual numbers, there may have been a smaller investment, but was very, very minuscule.
We continue to invest today, and we continue to grow our business, and net neutrality is a very large component of that because we believe in the foundation that net neutrality provides for equal access for everyone. We know that in a lot of marketplaces that 70% of the consumers only have one choice for their ISP, and we do not feel that as a competitive, it may be a competitive advantage, but it's not an open access advantage so that the consumer ends up with what they need at the end of the day. They need competition, they need a landscape which they can count on, and investment in the community. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a businessman. But I was very much part of the Bipartisan Telecommunications Act of 1996 when Craig McCaw and myself and a lot of other gentlemen began the path down a company called NextLink. If you remember the name NextLink and Craig McCaw, we built a company called NextLink. We later became XO Communications, one of the first CLECs in the United States. We raised $400 million during that time. And the Telecommunications Act of 96 gave us that very opportunity to do so. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I appreciate the opportunity that you've provided us to be a part of this. I'd like to say that we very much support net neutrality, and we will answer any questions that you may have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Chair now recognizes Commissioner McDowell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. It's great to be here. Ranking Member Latta, Chairman Pallone, and Ranking Member Walden. It is an honor always to be back before your committee, so thank you. I did serve at the FCC from 2006 to 2013. I'm a partner at Cooley LLP. I'm also a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute, but I testify today only in my personal capacity, and the views today that I express are purely my own. The debate over the best way to keep the internet open and freedom enhancing has raged for about 15 years. While the national political pendulum has swung back and forth during that time, the American internet ecosphere has blossomed as the most powerful explosion of entrepreneurial brilliance in human history. And let's make no mistake, the American internet market is the envy of the world. The legal and regulatory framework that provided the necessary certainty and protections for the phenomenon that became the internet was rooted in consumer protection, pro-competition, and antitrust statutes such as the Federal Trade Commission Act, the Clayton Act, the Sherman Act, as well as tort and contract common law, among others. Furthermore, a fundamental ingredient in this successful public policy recipe was Title I of the Communications Act of 1934. A quarter century ago, at the time of the internet's privatization, the Clinton-Gore administration made a wise choice to insulate the internet ecosphere from the heavy-handed regulation of Title II of the 1934 Act. This monumental decision, made at a crucial tipping point in the historical arc of the net, enjoyed not only bipartisan and nearly unanimous support here in the U.S., but internationally as well. In short, reliance on this time-tested legal construct created an environment where ideas hatched in dorm rooms or garages could become some of the most successful companies in the world in just a handful of years. Light touch regulation not only allowed the internet's edge to flourish, but it also provided the certainty and stability needed for the capital markets to take the leap to invest more than $1.6 trillion in private risk capital in broadband infrastructure since the mid-1990s. Furthermore, it was not that long ago that the FCC itself issued unanimous and bipartisan orders classifying broadband internet access service across all platforms as an information service. I supported such efforts in concert with my Democratic colleagues as recently as 2007. Needless to say, the political and public policy atmosphere has changed a few times since then. The FCC has attempted to regulate broadband services in various ways over the past 11 years, including by classifying broadband as a Title II telecommunications service for the first time in early 2015. And most recently, it acted in December of 2017 to restore the pre-2015 legal framework that was proven to work so well. To be clear, I do not think that additional legislation is needed to protect consumers, startups, or broadband investment. The proof is in the pudding of the internet's brief but brilliant history. Nonetheless, the public policy pendulum has been swinging back and forth above the heads of internet entrepreneurs like the sword of Damocles, and has created uncertainty, and it's counterproductive. For instance, anticipating the uncertainty in 2015 surrounding the Title II classification, there's evidence that capital markets slowed their investment in broadband infrastructure. After the Restoring Internet Freedom Order of 2018, investment in broadband rebounded. The time has come, however, for Congress to provide clarity and certainty by enacting new legislation. Such an effort could end this era of bitter and vitriolic zero-sum advocacy where, in order for one faction to win, others must lose. The 116th Congress serves during a unique period in the Internet's history, and it has the power to forge a reasonable majority to craft new bipartisan legislation that could last for decades and serve as a beacon for an open and freedom-enhancing Internet across the globe. Any bill passed by this House must have a reasonable chance to garner 60 votes in the Senate if there's to be any hope of it becoming law. The only path to that goal of meaningful, positive, and constructive public policy for the Internet, a law that will last beyond election cycles of 2 to 4 to 8 years, is through finding that majority that offers a win-win-win scenario for all who build and are affected by the Internet. Without a large bipartisan majority, any legislative effort is largely symbolic. A hopeful starting point, however, could begin with the principles laid out by FCC Chairman Michael Powell in 2005, some of which were echoed by Chairman Julius Genachowski in 2010, such as no anti-competitive throttling, blocking, or prioritization. This Congress has a rare opportunity to create a lasting legacy for the Internet ecosphere, and I look forward to helping you achieve it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. We now recognize Mr. Wood for 5 minutes.
Chairman Doyle and Pallone, Ranking Member Latta and Walden, and subcommittee members, thank you for inviting me back. Free Press Action is a nonpartisan nonprofit with 1.4 million members around the country, and we support H.R. 1644, the Save the Internet Act. Our members know that having equitable access to technology and information is the key to making change and making a living. Net neutrality is an issue of economic and racial justice. It's a timeless non-discrimination law safeguarding people's rights to say and see what they want online, free from unjust interference by ISPs. This bill restores the FCC's 2015 Open Internet Order, released 4 years ago today, as luck would have it, and it brings back the 3 bright line bans on blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization. But it does more than that, and that's a good thing. It restores the FCC's whole decision that adopted those rules, put them on the bedrock of Title II, and forbore from the parts of that law that we don't need. Restoring the 2015 framework is precisely the right approach on the law and the facts, and it's tremendously popular too. Huge majorities opposed its repeal. 86%, including 82% of Republicans, supported keeping the 2015 rules. So when I hear we can't have the 2015 rules back because we need a bipartisan solution, it reminds me of the Princess Bride line. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. This bill restores the FCC's power to make new rules, preventing new forms of ISP discrimination. That's why Section 202 of the Communications Act is crucial. The FCC needs that authority to address any unreasonable discrimination, like AT&T's schemes to favor its own video content and voice services, or Comcast's abuse of interconnection points to slow traffic to a crawl. Provisions like Section 201 are crucial too. It allows the FCC to address unjust and unreasonable behavior, like Verizon slowing down firefighters' data. Those who cynically say that wasn't a real net neutrality violation suggest that the FCC fiddle while forests and homes burn, rather than have the power to protect people's lives and public safety. They also say that Title II is somehow too new and untested, and yet also too old, while claiming, funnily enough, even older antitrust and FTC laws can protect the open internet. Their claims don't add up. The FCC has used the 2015 framework with great success for decades, for internet access, wireless voice, and business-grade broadband too. When it returned to the right law for net neutrality in 2015, that decision was upheld in the courts twice. Some still say we have no business applying laws written for 1930s monopolies. But what about present-day ones? By 2017, 39% of people in the US still had at most one choice for wireless broadband, offering downstream speeds of 25 megabits per second. At 300 megabits per second, that figure is 77%. But even if they have a couple of choices, I doubt many constituents back home complain to you that broadband is just so darn affordable and reasonable, they'd be glad for no oversight at all. Yet while the Save the Net bill restores the FCC's ability and mandate to watch out for abuses and fraudulent billing, it also locks in the FCC's 2015 decision to forbear from rate setting under Section 205. It also puts the FCC back on